In this video, we're going to walk through replacing or descaling the flow restrictors of your Marzocco Linea Espresso Machine and also opening up a stuck solenoid valve. The tools that you're going to need for this are a 13, 17, and 19 millimeter wrench, pliers, a screwdriver, and descaling solution or your new flow restrictor. The first thing that we're going to need to do here is turn off our machine and shut off the water supply valve. Then we can go ahead and take off the cup tray, group cover, drain tray. Next, we will take off this back plate here and the main power knob, which has a screw in it. So there's a screw in that, and then there's a few screws holding this back plate in that we'll need to remove to take that off. Next, we're going to need to loosen this expansion valve by turning it counterclockwise with our pliers, and that will release any excess pressure built up in the brew boiler. You might see some water come out of this valve, and you might not, but the main thing is that our bottom portion of the pressure gauge reaches 0. You don't want to see any pressure in the brew boiler. Next, we're going to remove the copper tube on the left side of whichever group you need to replace the flow restrictor. It's the copper tube that runs from the solenoid valve here to the group neck. So I'm going to use my 13 millimeter wrench to remove this fitting while bracing the bottom of the solenoid valve with my other hand. So we're turning this counterclockwise. And once you get it loosened up, we're not going to remove it completely. We're going to leave it until we get this other nut loosened up as well. With a 17 millimeter wrench, and we will brace the other side, the fitting next to it, with a 19 millimeter wrench. Then we will be able to remove both of these nuts simultaneously. And remove that copper tube. You might get a few drips, that's all right. And this top fitting is the flow restrictor, and we can remove that with a 2 millimeter Allen key. It might be a little bit tight at first, and you're just gonna want to wiggle that back and forth. Like if it feels tight, wiggle it back and forth a little bit. Don't crank on it too much. We don't want to strip this flow restrictor out, but once it's loose, then we can remove it completely. So my flow restrictor does not need to be replaced, but if it did, I can find my new flow restrictor and thread that back in and just get it snug, not tight by any means. If you need to replace it again, you're going to want to be able to remove that. If you are descaling your flow restrictor, you can drop this into a little cup of descaling solution and hot water and let that sit for an hour or something, whatever it says on the instructions of the solution that you're using, and then replace that. You can just look through that little opening and make sure that it's completely clear of scale buildup and that it's ready to go back inside the machine. Then we can replace our copper tube with new flow restrictor back into these two fittings. And it's best to try to start to thread these on at the same time. Then once they're finger tight, we can come back with our 13mm wrench, bracing the one side of the solenoid, and tighten that, not too tight. And then with our 17 and 19mm wrench, we can again brace the one fitting and tighten the copper flare fitting. Next, we're going to tighten up our expansion valve by turning it clockwise, just by hand. We're going to fine tune this later after we turn the machine on. But you can take it pretty tight with your fingers. Now we can turn the water back on, and once we have that back on, we can use our knob to turn the machine back on. And now while the machine is heating up, I'm going to adjust the expansion valve so that the needle for the brew boiler pressure is resting at around 10.5 bars while the machine is idling. So as you can see, it's going above 12 bars right now, so I'm going to need to turn that counterclockwise. Until it stabilizes right around 10.5 bars. Before you put your machine back together, you're going to want to check for leaks, tighten any fittings that need to be tightened, and then put the panels back on the machine and measure the flow rate from each group and make sure they're consistent.